One of the things that was interesting also about the Fort Greene scene was that it had several generations. Obviously, I mentioned Betty Carter, Cecil Taylor, that group. My kind of generation, which was Branford, Winton, Lawrence Fishburne, those people. And then in the 90s, a guy had an idea to start a sort of a supper club, spoken word spot called the Brooklyn Moon. And this became a third site, a third wave. He began doing these spoken word things on a Friday night. And his MC was a guy named, who became known as Mos Def. Mos Def then attracted Erykah Badu. Erykah Badu was recording her first album, literally, she's living above a clothing store about 3 blocks away. She started doing spoken word there. Common from Chicago started doing spoken word there. Chris Rock, who was a young comedian, would kind of stick his head in. And another scene, another iteration of this Fort Greene thing started happening. The place became famous because, not only for the talent there, but because there was a very angry, big, mean lawyer who lived above the place. And he refused to let anyone clap. He would come down and complain. So everyone started doing this kind of pretentious finger-snapping thing as a way to kind of, okay, we have to celebrate the art, let's just do this. And it became the symbol of this kind of proto-hipster scene in Fort Greene. And so you had this wave of 1, 2, 3 generations of people who, again, this interaction had happened. Most in Talib met at part of the Brooklyn Moon thing. Black Star comes out of that, and a sort of a lot of the beginnings of what we became backpack hip hop, if you will, comes out of this little spot on Fulton Street. The neighborhood now has been gentrified, and it is much more of all the brownstones that I could get, duplex for $600 in 1985 is now, those buildings are worth $2-3 billion. Sports arenas being built, so the whole neighborhood has changed over. But it just struck me how powerful this idea of community is, and how much, even in an age of digital everything, that the ability to meet face-to-face is still to be the essential quality that creates creative community and makes things happen. And that there's lessons to be learned going forward about how, almost if you can't engineer it, to become part of something. So this last thread has been interesting because when we show the film Brooklyn Bohemian, which I'm going to show tonight, one of the things that's come up when we show it in the States has been people in their 20s saying to me, oh, how do I meet people? Like, what do you mean, how do you meet? They're meeting people online, they have incredible connections, people are doing incredible things online, but there's nothing like that face-to-face. And I think that if there's one message or idea that comes out of my experiences, certainly, is this idea that if you're not where it's happening, you need to go where it's happening. And if you're not near where it's happening, you need to find out where other people are who are like-minded individuals. I mean, that's the key thing to everything that I've done. I mean, I've been working with Chris Rock, the comedian actor. We met, he was in like a struggling young comedian, and he had this idea for a stupid movie. And he came to my house, he had like nothing. He said, Nelson, can you help me write this movie? And I said, no. I mean, come on, dude, what do you got? So I gave him 4 questions to answer, and I figured I got rid of him, and I'd never see him again. And he came back with these 4 questions answered. We made a movie called CB4, which was sort of a crazy rap musical, 1993, excuse me. And now, 20 years later, we still work together. We just did a documentary called Good Hair that played at a lot of festivals. It was a crazy comedy film, a documentary about black women's hair it's funny, but it's informative. It's got this idea that we're still working together 20 years later after meeting, again, through this particular set of geographical presets, which was Fort Greene, still strikes me. And a lot of the relationships that I have, commercially, businessly, personally, go back to that era, which is why Arthur Baker's sitting here. Arthur and I met, I believe, at Record World Magazine.
It was Record World before Billboard, yeah.
And it's like 81, 82, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it went out of business in 82.
Yeah, well, when did you start working there?
81.
Well, it was right in the beginning, because you would see me, because if you had been there long enough, you probably wouldn't have. In the beginning,
What's interesting is Arthur comes from another community that hasn't gotten
No props at all.
Yeah.
But I'm from Boston, and when I came out of there, we sort of created some sort of scene around guys by the name of Maurice Starr, Michael Johnson, a few other guys, and we started making dance. Well, it wasn't. We were making disco music.
Didn't they call it club records then too?
I think it was at the tail end of disco before it was a bad word. But we just met, and we all met around the studio, and Maurice and Michael basically lived in what was loosely could be described as a commune,
right?
Which that's a whole other story, because Sun Ra used to live in the neighborhood, and we'd all go over there and hang out, and it was very weird.
Where was it? Talking about where you located?
Well, it was in their place was in Roxbury, so basically I met them in the studio doing a session, and then we became friends, and then sort of I was the first one out of Boston. I mean, we did some records. We did the North End record. We did a few things that did all right, but then I moved to New York and started making records, and I became successful, and then they sort of followed me down, and Maurice and Michael would stay with me in my place in Brooklyn, by the way, and I'd have all the guys from Boston coming and crashing on the floor, on the couches, on the floors, and out of that came New Edition and New Kids on the Block. So I mean, through that connection, like the fact that one guy from Boston had moved down, sort of opened it up to everybody in a way, which was sort of cool. It was sort of, I don't know if it would have happened if everyone stayed in Boston, because the access wasn't really there. But once I made it, I brought all the other guys down, and then it just sort of exploded. But all the musicians and all the singers and everything, it was a total Boston scene. It was total, like, literally Boston, Roxbury, all those guys came from there. Bobby Brown, Belle Biv DeVoe, all that stuff. So it was definitely a scene. The Wahlbergs. I mean, so it's stretched further than just music, obviously, the whole thing.
It's interesting. One of the things also about these ideas about creative community is the catalytic agent. There's usually a person who emerges out of the scene somehow, who becomes the agent of, in this case.
Yeah, I would probably say it was me, because I just made it down to New York first, and Maurice was staying with me, and he came back one day really dejected. And Maurice Starr was not like a guy you would think of being dejected. He was always up, and he goes, I went to every record company, and no one wants to sign the group. And I go, well, let me hear it. And he played me this record. It was Candy Girl, New Edition. I said, well, I'll sign it. I'll put it out right away. And through that, the whole thing happened. And when New Kids happened, he brought them down and recorded them in my studio in New York.
How come you didn't?
Because he already had a deal. By then it was,
He was on.
He was on.
Well, if in the Fort Greene model would have been Spike Lee. I mean, I think one of the things is this idea of the person who becomes the visionary marketer or the visionary.
Yeah, I mean, there's in Paris right now. There's been a whole sort of electronic music scene. I'd say over the last 10 and more years with Daft Punk, from Daft Punk to Justice and all the other people in Bradinsky. There's a whole scene. DJ Mehdi. And that person would have been Pedro Winter, because basically he's the promoter, he's the guy who sort of made it all happen, and he's worked with a lot of the different people. But there's a really thriving scene in Paris right now. Like, I'd say electronic music-wise, that's probably the biggest one in the world right now, and has been for quite a while, because he keeps reviving it and bringing the next generation in, from Daft Punk to Justice. So I think that's definitely a thriving scene, and that goes with your theory, definitely.
It's interesting too for me. Constantly, I'm always trying to find out what the next thing or what the new ideas are. One of the things interesting from an American point of view, and you guys probably, this is all hat to you guys, is how the Beatha thing has affected what in America what was then seemed totally immune to it for years and years. We don't like rave culture, dance music. It's not really happening. And now, if you go to America, almost every quote-unquote R&B singer has been hanging out in Spain.
Yeah,
and doing.
Unfortunately, it sort of ruined R&B. But
there's actually a theory that R&B is dying because of the music coming out of Spain, which is an interesting. How the hell would that happen? But from Usher to Jennifer Hudson, there's all these kind of dance-oriented records that now have become the new staple of black music. It's very rare, ironically now, to hear a record coming out of America by a young or black artist that isn't been affected by that music scene. For us, it's kind of like a shocker, but it's a good example of another kind of underground scene, which was, for us, was Ibiza was underground to you guys, but certainly in America.
Well, it started underground.
Right.
It definitely started underground. I mean, basically, yeah, I mean, it all happened really organically in a way, because people would go, you know, P. Diddy went and a few other people went, and then they'd tell Will.I.am, and they'd just sort of go hang out at clubs and hear David Guetta DJ, and then, you know, they want to make a record because, you know, it seemed fun. But I don't think in the beginning it was thought of as, oh, we're gonna make a lot of money by doing dance records. I don't really think that. I think it was the drugs, actually. You know.
Explain to me David Guetta, how that happened. I have no fun.
Well, David Guetta started as a DJ in France, Parisian DJ, who was a hip hop DJ in the beginning. So he had those roots. So that has something to do with him being able. He has the background to connect with some of the acts who he's working with now, because he knows
a little Wayne with him. I was like,
he knows the roots of this stuff. But he was a working DJ, and then he started doing a party called "Fuck Me, I'm Famous," which, you know, people were interested by the concept, I guess, and that definitely appealed to the R&B community, you know. And basically, they'd go in and hang at the club in Ibiza, and he'd give them a mic, and they'd all get on the mic, and that's how it happened. I mean, he was sort of, I don't know if he was ever a super credible DJ, but he was a working DJ for like 10 years before he blew up. So it's sort of, you know, and he has roots. That's the thing. Like the whole 808 thing for me, the project I'm doing was one night I went to Pasha and he said to me, Arthur, where's your 808? Go get your 808. Everyone's using 808. You should be using an 808 again. And you know, and a year later I bought an 808. You know.
So just want to give a background. I just did a short look at some point about 808 drum machines as part of a series called Focus Forward in the U.S. And Arthur's interviewed in it, obviously, because Arthur and Planet Rock are central text in the 808 story. Turns out Arthur himself is now working on a full-length documentary on the 808, and has interviewed already half the world.
Yeah, we've interviewed pretty much, you know, A-Track, Diplo, Questlove, Pradinsky, New Order, Fatboy Slim.
So the 808, in a sense, becomes in its way its own kind of text in terms of this idea of community, because out of this, I love it. One of the great things about what's happened with hip-hop in particular, and dance music in general, is the idea that technology is created. It sits there for any number of years in some cases. The sampler is another example of that. And then somehow somebody figures out, we can do something with this piece of crap.
Yeah.
So, and in many cases, I guess, Arthur, you were the 808. You and John Roby kind of.
Yeah, and I was, and the whole thing with the 808 was it was an accidental use. I mean, basically, we looked in the. We were making a record with Bambaataa. I was making a record with him in Soul Sonic Force, and we needed a drum machine. Before that, I had always used live drummers, and it was the first one because we were trying to get sort of the Kraftwerk feel from Numbers. So we just went in the Village Voice and we started playing Man with Drum Machine. So I called the guy up. I said, you know, how much? $20. He came up and we showed him what to program, and it was an 808 drum machine. And that's how we actually used it the first time. And then obviously once it smashed it, I went out and bought one the next day. Yeah. Probably about $1,000, maybe less. I don't remember. I know now they're a lot more. Now they cost more than they were when they were new. But I mean, basically, a lot of the people we've interviewed who like name check it for days and use the sounds have never used the machine. They just use the drums, the sounds, the samples. Very few. Like in my doc, when I interview someone, I bring the machine and I go, program me a beat. And the only one really, Richie Houghton programmed the shit out of it. He's a really good 808 programmer, and Jelly Bean Benitez could do it too. So they were so basically that's part of the film, showing people programming beats and, you know, performing with the 808. And but I mean, the bottom line is a lot of the other guys are afraid of it, you know, afraid to touch it. You know, it's like Felix was like, "No, I can't go near that shit." You know. But I mean, the bottom line, it is a thread through dance music, at least in hip hop, that through the years, I mean, maybe there's lulls, but literally you could take a hit record from every year since hip hop began, and there's going to be one track that's used the 808, and so it is an interesting thread to the whole dance culture.
Because a lot of these things become, at least people use these different terms. It's electro this, or it's hip hop, or trance. But when you really get down to the DNA of a lot of this, it's the idea of technology applied and taking. One of the other ideas that's interesting about using this, the 808 particularly, is the idea of how live music or live musicianship, the kind that I grew up on, the Stax Motown models, let's say, then become almost retranslated through technology into one of the things. A mutual project that Arthur and I are beginning to work on together is a documentary history of funk, and obviously funk has been documented in a number of different ways. We're actually going to go on the road, go on the road kind of, and sort of actualize it in the sense that one of the places in this idea of cultural community is Dayton, Ohio. Now, Dayton, Ohio has gotten zero, pub, zero credibility as a music site. Yet when you look up funk and say Dayton, Ohio, you're saying Heat Wave, Slave, Ohio Players, Zap, Roger, or Earlybird outside of there. Up the road about 20 miles in Cincinnati is Bootsy, which speaks for itself in terms of funk. King Records, which was where James Brown recorded majority of his records, especially the innovative ones, most innovative, were recorded, a lot of them in Cincinnati, and that's where he found Bootsy, who was in a band there. So, and I'm leaving out about 4 or 5 other bands. For whatever reason, this town of Dayton, Ohio, which is a little town, like a lot of those towns in the Midwest in America, it's not far from the Mississippi River. It's part along the road where black folks moved up from Mississippi and Alabama up to Mississippi and stopped in these little towns along Ohio, Indiana. Ended up, obviously, everyone knows about Detroit, everyone knows about Chicago, but along the spine of mid-America are these cities that became very black because they had jobs. They were working class jobs. In the case of Dayton, they had a big Air Force base. They had 2 factories. So in the 70s and 80s, folks had money. And they had money to go out on the weekends. And they had money to support live bands. Also part of that same dynamic in Dayton was that it's near a bunch of colleges. Ohio State University, Bowling Green University, the Black College, Oberlin University. And so that meant that bands that were created had jobs aside from the local scene that could actually tour up and down this little region of the Ohio Valley. So out of Dayton becomes this whole idea that Steve Arrington and so on and so forth. Funk, as we know it, has a home, and a lot of it is Dayton, Ohio. And that hasn't been really documented. So a lot of this, again, this idea of what I don't know yet, but we're going to find out when we hang out in Dayton, is what are the particulars? Who was a catalytic person? Was it in the case of Memphis, if you go to Memphis, Tennessee, and talk to them, they'll tell you there's a guy, literally a Professor Dawkins. He taught at there was one or two black high schools in Memphis. Basically, he was a teacher of Maurice White, Booker T. MGs, Isaac Hayes. There's one guy in Memphis who was like the guy who taught literally a generation of musicians who then went on around the globe. So again, this idea of the catalytic agent was really fascinating to me. Also, since we're here, we should shout out a catalytic agent who's in the house here. This is Seymour Stein.
Yeah, right there.
And we just talk about Seymour and why he fits into our little template.
Wow, he so many.
First, everyone should say, Mr. Stein.
I mean, I would see Seymour as the agent in New York, really, because bands, the bands that he signed and were involved with, from Talking Heads to Madonna to the Ramones. So I mean, basically, there's a case of a record guy who actually had, as an A&R person, like A&R people don't exist anymore like that, but was open to all sorts of types of music and just was into talent and creativity. So I mean, obviously, when you have someone there you can go to, all the people, if you sign Talking Heads or Ramones, you're gonna, people who like those bands are gonna want to be on the same label. So it's almost like a label as that scene, as opposed to a geography.
Absolutely.
Brooklyn, but Sire Records. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too that this idea of, and this sort of devolved the record business, this record business landscape. One of the things that we find, at least in the hip-hop R&B scene in America today, is the absence or the lack of these. Seemingly, we're having a real problem with not talent, but with these catalytic agents. And that the fact is that when you had Russell Simmons, we had Def Jam, or, God, there's so many examples. I'll use Russell because he's probably the most prominent. A person who becomes a promoter slash A&R slash producer and a rainmaker, someone who's going to go out and yell from the top of his lungs that what I have is credible and pay attention to it. For whatever reason, the breakdown of the recording industry, there used to be these little fiefdoms, in New York in the hip-hop era, there was Def Jam, Cold Chilling Records, you had Tyrone, Tyrone Williams, Profile, Corey Robin, Tom Silverman. A lot of what we call hip-hop was, especially in that era that expanded it, was really one or two people with an incredible amount of belief and a lot of hustle. And what's happened is that they had access to, eventually, the major label distribution networks. And the more fragmented era we have, it's been harder to find who is that person who's going to lead the way to the future of this music. Who's going to be that person whose taste we trust. And I think that's really what we're talking about. Is that, for me now as a guy who's been in the game a long time, is still trying to figure out where the next thing is going to come from or where the next energy is I should be paying attention to. It's much harder for me in New York now to get a grip on that.
Well, there were like DFA, James Murphy's label. So So I mean, there are, and Ed Banger in Paris. So I mean, there are some guys like Pedro and James who, you trust.
I'm talking more from an R&B point of view.
On R&B,
that's what I'm saying.
Couldn't tell you.
And that's why we become infected by the
dance bug.
Exactly. Because there's no one setting an agenda right now. I mean, it's secular. And maybe there's some kid somewhere in the middle of Tulsa, Oklahoma, who's got a hell of a scene that I don't know about yet. But certainly that is one of the more interesting things that's happened in America. The number one place, if you went to the U.S. now, for that kind of idea would be Atlanta. Atlanta is now the mecca of black music in the United States, for better or worse.
And that came from, the real estate was cheap, people were moving down there, and saying it was really great to live there.
So part of again, geography and real estate has a huge part of these things. Definitely, New York is like a Key Sweat. New York, Mr. Make 'em Last Forever. He's one of the first guys that I'm moving to Atlanta. I'm like, you moving to Atlanta? What are you doing down there? Well, of course, he took New York money to Atlanta, and he had a mansion. And so other people said, yo, Key Sweat's got a good place. And the other key thing, interesting enough, is I did catalytic agent again, was LaFace Records, which was LA and Babyface. Moving from LA, which was saturated with R&B and pop producer writer teams, moving to Atlanta and putting their flag down as this is going to be our place. And they found TLC down there. Obviously, Tony Braxton was another artist, and so on. They made Atlanta into a plot, and they did another thing. They found Dallas Austin, who became a great producer. They gave Jermaine Dupri his leg up. And so they were both catalytic agents and started their own label. They found young talent either from Atlanta or brought people down there. All of them were attracted by the idea that you could get a lot of, with New York and LA money, and Atlanta, boom, suddenly you're living in a big mansion, right? The second thing that happened, there was an underground hip-hop scene there. It's still a guy named Pastor Troy, who's been there for years, never really broke out of the city, but he helped create a 12-inch scene, or mixtape scene there. And the other element of Atlanta hip-hop that runs through Ludacris, T.I., all those guys, is strip clubs. If you go to Atlanta, to this day, it's not about your mixtape. It's not about, it's about, can you get people to drop it like it's hot in a strip club? And so, most of the music you see that comes out of ATL that's dance-oriented is broken at strip clubs. They go in, the DJs...
Miami also, though, right? Miami,
I'm sure it's because Miami has become...
Miami bass, which influenced the Atlanta stuff,
right.
I think, too. Yeah.
So this idea that, again, a local idea about the strip club. The strip club DJ gets the most payola in Atlanta. Because paying his record during the peak moment and getting the most, there's even guys down there who pay guys to throw money in the air when their record's on to give the idea that this is the hottest record that's being played that night. So the basics of the record business don't change, hype, promotion, but the landscape, literally, of where it happens is very different. How long are we talking, guys? So so this is kind of, we want to just talk about these ideas of partly because we're in Liverpool, the idea of relationship of music to space, geography. I mean, so much about, in my writings over the years from Detroit on through, this idea of how location, culture, music being one expression of that culture, obviously clothing, style, slang, all come out of these geographical things. And the history of popular music can almost be written as a journey of music from localities to global to mainstream, where it made some form lose its meaning. That's one of the issues, again, with going back to hip hop, is and there's a very big debate in the States now about, does hip hop exist? When we use this phrase hip hop, what does that really mean in this year? Is hip hop defined by Afrika Bambaataa? Is it defined by what was the old school, lyrically based thing? Is dance music? Because really, what we're talking about now is a re-evolution of less lyrical skills and more track based. Is that hip hop? Is hip hop just about certain beats? And I mean, it's really a kind of age and philosophical debate about what hip hop means. As it becomes more mainstream and more pop, do you lose what a thing becomes? Once McDonald's is using your music, and your music was based on being an outsider music and being oppositional, even sonically, do you really mean the same thing when you're? So I mean, I don't have the answer, but certainly it's something that really concerns the people who love the culture, and it's something that we wonder about as it goes on to its 40th birthday. Please, go ahead.
What does rhythm and blues? I mean, to Sid Nathan, who was King Records, it meant...
And you worked at King, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
He was my greatest mentor. What it meant to me, what it meant to him, was Wynonie Harris, Charles Brown, Roy Brown, Amos Milner. To me, it meant, my idol was Fats Domino. I mean, everything revolved around him. And it was, of course, James Brown, Little Richard, Ray Charles, and doo-wop music, which was an adjunct of it. The best of which came out of Chicago, as Chess and BJ, the Flamingos and the Moonglows, but also New York and everywhere else. I think that rhythm and blues has not been rhythm and blues for years. Motown.
Then it became R&B.
Motown made rhythm, and in a great way. I just saw Barry a couple of weeks ago. He was at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. Motown made R&B hot, but it's the same with everything. I mean, this has been going on for hundreds of years. I mean, music, it didn't begin with us. Sure. And it's always been evolving.
Well, I mean, I wrote a book in 1988 called The Death of Rhythm and Blues, so I'm not. Yeah. So I think one of the things interesting about this the phraseology we use, right? We use these words, rhythm and blues, R&B, rock and roll, hip hop, and they become. I see them as they're boxes. They're boxes, and we pour what we like into them. But I do say this. What happens at a certain point with almost every one of these cultures, at some point the community decides that this is what this is. Be it when disco happened. When disco, the word came out, there were a million records that were quote unquote disco records. But in a year or two after the word came out, there were records that were overtly disco records, had certain musical, hi-hat and crazy string arrangements, and suddenly that's disco. I think the same thing happens in this age. I mean, electro, trance, etc. to those outside of the communities, they're just words. To people within the communities, they're very specific. And I think that's what's interesting about this dialogue about what you bring up, is that, I mean, all these words are very imprecise that we use to describe music ultimately, because we're trying to, what is that phrase you're trying to talk about, architecture with air or something? It kind of, in a way, doesn't make sense, but we use them because they give us a general idea. Yeah, please.
I'm sorry,
No, go ahead, please.
If you see with rhythm and blues, what they first called it was race music.
Right.
Which was horrific.
Right.
And it was Paul Ackerman and Jerry Wexler at Billboard who changed it to rhythm and blues, which was good for the time. And they all, country music, country and western, they called hillbilly music. I mean, if you can believe that. And they changed that to country and western. So, but I mean, in reality, music is either good or bad. I mean, that's really what it gets down to.
I mean, it's interesting too, because if I was a country western or then a country fan from the 80s, when I hear on the radio that passes the country today would probably make me go crazy.
It does. It sounds like it came right out of the Brill Building. And like they took the Brill Building and moved it from 1619 Broadway down to, West End Avenue in Nashville. So you're absolutely right.
So let's open up. I don't know if we've sparked any gonads up there, or people have any ideas or want to throw a couple of questions or comments, even better. And I think like this gentleman here. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mark Jones from Watertown. There's only two types of music. Good and bad. Music made with feeling and passion, and because it's supposed to be made for reality's sake, and music that isn't to me. And obviously putting music in boxes has happened, and to me that is, I'm sorry if there's any in the room, but lazy journalists who just, people that just want to put you in a box because they get nervous about not understanding it. Music is either made, as you said, with soul, for a meaning or reason. And to me, the industry in a way now, is, with the television, that other thing that's on the TV now.
You mean the Idol stuff?
Apparently.
The Idol X Factor things?
Apparently, there's something, yeah.
Well, let's raise it to the room, the whole room, because I mean,
what I'm saying is that it's almost come around, and the industry is almost like in a 50 situation where music is being almost created, as you just said, it's being invented. You know what I mean?
All right, sir, in the back.
Yeah, got some interesting music.
Stand up, sir. So please stand up.
I've got a dodgy back, so. We've got some interesting music around at the moment, whether it's Skrillex, Deadmau5, Azealia Banks, you know what I mean? And I think that they're doing some stuff that's interesting, but used to, don't normally say this, I think, used to are heroes of mine. But when I started, it was as a DJ, because of the records that Arthur made. You know what I mean? Whether it was for Tommy Boy or I didn't know you did Candy Girl. I didn't read the thing, but that's an incredible record. And it was called the electro scene at the time. We didn't know anything about hip hop because we were in England. And there was a few of us. One of them being a guy called Gerald, who hopefully you've interviewed for your the music that we did came out of club music. So it was whatever we were playing, and we were playing breaks, playing early house, we didn't know what it was, whether it was done by, there was some Detroit stuff, I think, and some of the early electro records were actually house music. And I remember there was a track called Set It Off, Harlequin 4, which was massive in this country, absolutely massive.
But I think you do need to give it a name. I know there's good and bad music, but you need to, because it's like being a member of a gang without a gang name. I mean,
I was going to speak up. I was going to stand up for lazy music journalists as well. Yeah. Because let me finish, sir, please. One of the things that happens, we have these. If you have writing about music, and we have to have writing about music because it's part of how people find out about music, without names, you have, because if you're going to describe a Motown record,
It's like Muddy Waters. What is he?
Right.
He's music. Yeah.
And also the artists, themselves are self-defining,
Yeah.
because blues artists are very clearly, so it's in this, people make decisions because one of the great lessons I learned from Russell Simmons, and there's not that many, but he only one, and that is, he said to me about the Beastie Boys, but this relates to all kinds of music, that they were defined not simply by who liked them, they were defined by who hated them. And the people who hated them made the people who liked them more.
Good point.
And so, so having a definition of yourself, almost every artist I've ever interviewed comes up with a phrase for the music.
Yeah.
Because it's both a marketing hook and it's a way to separate yourself from those outside of your community. I remember interviewing Morris Day when he first came to New York in 1981, 82. And I asked him, about what do you guys do when you're number one, he was lying like crazy. Who's Jamie Starr? No, he's not Prince. Don't worry about that. But even bigger was he said, we're not a funk band. I said, you're not a funk band. Did Time run a funk band? But to him, it was their way. No, we're not gonna. We're trying to separate ourselves from what came before. So I think you need words. The problem with words is they're imprecise, and within those discussions of the language of music, there have to be modifiers in each individual. So I mean, I think without these words, how do we talk about?
Well, for instance, dubstep. Okay, when it was an underground thing, and the people who made it came up with the name, or a journalist, or whoever, but they didn't mind the name.
Right.
And now everything's dubstep.
Right.
I mean, it's sort of, in the beginning, you take something that's very underground, and you're proud of the name, and you're really into it, and then when it becomes a wider thing, it sort of just becomes a bad word, I guess. But, I mean, that's happened all through dance music, and people want to come up with a new name, when it was electro, and then it was Latin freestyle, and then it was something else. It's how to differentiate what you're doing, what you're doing from what came before you. So the guys doing the electro, the Latin kids who were doing Latin, it was Latin hip hop and then Latin freestyle.
Right.
So I mean,
one of my favorite stories about this goes back to New Jack Swing. So a friend of mine named Barry Michael Cooper was a writer at the Village Voice, and he did an interview with Teddy Riley, and he was writing about that whole sudden movement when you had Teddy Riley and you had Keith Sweat, and there was a whole Guy, and all these bands sort of came out, and he came with the idea that New Jack was then the inheritor of Youngblood. New Jack was like the new guy, the new hip guy, New Jack. So you were New Jack if you knew Kid on the Block, or in the street sense. Yeah. And then the swing beat on the drum machine.
Right.
The swing. So he combined the two himself when he was doing his profile. And the Village Voice used it in the headline. And they didn't even call it, they said New Jack Swingers. The guys Teddy Riley goes, my God, that's it. He makes a record called New Jack Swing. And he puts every artist he's ever produced on that record. And suddenly it becomes a thing. So I think that this whole, again, how these, going back to this original idea of community, these communities are all self-defining. Because to be part of a community, to be part of a gang, literally, to become a musical gang, in a sense, is very important. Because I think so much about what music is, as a culture, is identification. Going back to the Mods and Rockers, in this country, what you wear, what the slang you use, without those things, for the person who's not the total music head, it is those signifiers that drive them to think, because they want to be identified with something outside of themselves. And I think one of the reasons that hip-hop has had such a long run as a cultural movement is precisely because it's such an easy culture. There's so many points of entry. You can dress hip-hop, and that changes over time, but there's certain signifiers that still work. The slang is constantly evolving. There's been 18 million types of the joint, the bomb, blah, 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 blah. We can go on and on. I could go for like 15 minutes on just hot phrases, in hip-hop, right? Bang it, etc., etc. So the language, and obviously the music itself. And so each subset within, G-Funk was those guys clearly said, okay, we're a community, we're using funk samples, we're not New York, we use the samples differently than they use them, and we're going to make our own brand. So I think that it's just an amazing and kind of fun part of it is that, do you respect the brand, so to speak? And how long does that brand have currency before it becomes into the melon?
Well, I think the brand becomes a problem as soon as a corporation gets hold of it and uses it as a marketing box and tries to then usurp the people who are actually creating it.
What's your favorite example of that?
That's a very good question. I mean, I see my first experience in the UK of what would be loosely termed hip-hop was the Last Poets when they moved over here, who are now kind of demeaned and looked at sideways and laughed about as being a bit hippie. But you wanted to, as a white European, find out why the black man was angry in America, read the Last Poets.
Sure.
And a lot of it was encapsulated by that where Gill up downtown. I'm not really keen on that last album building. You know, it seems to have been taken by a corporation and turned into something different.
You mean when he did it before he died?
Yeah, the last album.
I just think he wasn't that present.
Yeah. Figures.
Yes, I mean, I think that I quite think they had more to do with where he was.
Research got the better of it, let's put it that way.
Yes. Let's have a couple more voices that have spoken, sir.
Yeah, I think I hear where you're at on some level, in the sense that the 808 has become a tangible signifier for a sonic movement. But I guess the question I want to pitch to Mr. Baker, please,
Sure.
is given today's emerging musical technologies, what do you wish you had from today on a technological level that wasn't available 10 years ago?
Well, it was 30 years ago, so. Nothing, because it would have gotten in the way of what we were making at the time, you know,
Sure.
because we were making something new, and if we had more stuff around, we would have got confused, you know, it was more like the fact that we had a great Neve board when we made the track, but we only had, you know, a drum machine, one synthesizer, a couple of delay units, and it was, you know, it was the combination of the people in the room and the equipment. I think now you have too much stuff when you're making. I make records a lot now, and I try to limit my plugins and limit all the things I have available because you'll never. You know, you never finish anything. So I'm glad that at the time I didn't have anything else. You know?
Right.
That's interesting. So what you talk about, that's an interesting idea that you feel like maybe too many options is almost too...
Well, it's hard. It's bad. It's bad. I mean, you have too many options now in making records, and maybe if you've always had that, then it's not a problem, but I never had that. So now that I have that, I try to stay away from it. You know, it's sort of the whole idea now that musicians have more equipment in their phone than we had in the studio, basically, or more sampling power, all that stuff. You know, to me, I mean, no, it's great that you can go on the train and make a record, you know, which I did. You know, I worked on a record on the way up here, but if I had all the plugins that a lot of the people I know have, and I had too many options, it would do my head in. So I don't, you know.
Do you think when people complain, I mean, you know, and this would be generational, but do you think that part of the challenge with contemporary music is the fact is that it's almost, it's interesting that it's too many options, but there seems to be a disconnect that a lot of people feel between the emotional connection and the sonic connection. That's a complaint that you get across generations, actually.
Well, I mean, in dance music, lyrically, lyrics are shit. You know? No, they're shit. They're, you know, it's all about it's just basically about the act of dancing in a club or things that will make people want to dance. I mean, there's a place for it, but you know, there's no soul or anything left in all the guys who are like going onto the dark side of, you know, the electronic thing. You know, it's horrible. But you know, I understand what they're doing and who it's directed to. So, but. What was the question?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fine answer. Can we have some time to take a couple more comments, questions? Anybody else? Sir.
Okay. Going back, there's a couple of things I want to touch on. I mean, the genre-based thing. I remember when, I mean, this goes through it, when, you know, we created the label back nearly 20 years ago now with Wall Sound and other artists and labels that were trying to do the same thing. Electronic dance music was very much fluffy for our industry culture. And you weren't allowed to say, and this is something that is going back to the references, you weren't allowed to say that you liked hip-hop, you liked Steely Dan, and you liked Kraftwerk. You weren't allowed to say all of those things at the same time. And that's how the music came together that we created and a few other labels created and people created, the Chemical Brothers, the Propeller Heads. And I remember bringing it over to America, remember? And sitting in, trying to have meetings with people about electronic music, and a lot of the industry in America, you know, it hadn't really broken out in certain places. But then when you know, we did the props and the chems were there, people were like, that's a guitar, and there's drums, and it kind of kick-started a base of, even though Chicago and Detroit here had developed for quite a considerable amount of time, and you know, the electro scene in New York as well. And it was quite interesting to see how that evolved. People got on board then, right, and related to it a bit from that point of view. And then obviously it died, or it dipped, should we say. And then seeing, you know, it taking Mr. Guetta producing a Black Eyed Peas record, and to see every urban artist in America, all they talk about is electronic music and dance music. And I suppose, you know, at a major label level, seeing that actually transmit across the country and raves happening in Buttfuck to wherever now, yeah? I mean, it's quite incredible for me to actually see it finally drop.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing, and I think, again, that's one of the great things about this whole journey of music and culture is that, you know, there's always, no one can foresee, even 2 years ahead, a year ahead, what is going to emerge out of a community, and then affect the globe in a completely way, totally unexpected. Absolutely.
I mean, is anything else dropped there?
Well, right now, in fact, I would say right now that is what's really driving most of the major. I mean, there's still, you know, it's interesting that people who would go be quote unquote R&B, Seymour, are considered like they're the alternative. Yeah. Now, someone like even Raphael Sadiq is considered alternative.
Yeah, I meant pill-wise.
Don't ask me.
Don't ask me.
But I mean, you know, the whole idea of dance music blowing up being something new is insane. Because seeing, for instance, okay, CNC Music Factory, okay, they started in the late 80s, and they used to work in my studio, and they'd make these underground records that were underground records. Within a year, from being the most underground group, they had sold probably 5 million records, and that was in 1 year, and they were huge. And it happens, you know. Fatboy Slim sold millions. I mean, people have done it. Now the thing is that they've sort of acknowledged it as a more of a European. It's sort of a European scene coming to. I think, you know, it's sort of it's the Ibiza in Las Vegas. I mean,
Ibiza in Las Vegas.
Yeah,
what a sight! Please.
It didn't start there, and it didn't start where I'm going to tell you it started. But when movies became talkies, every movie said all singing, all dancing, all talking. All talking was the third thing they said, because it was the least important. Those movies with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, dance and music were always joined at the hip. Always, back centuries ago, okay? Some of the great classical music was. I mean, what is all this discussion about? I mean, I don't understand. But the thing that you brought out that really is important, which is absolutely true, is community. And Detroit was always a great, before Motown, there were people there were some of the greatest talent came out of Detroit. Billy Ward and the Dominoes, Clyde McFadden and Jackie Wilson were the lead singers of that group. And also Hank Ballard and the Midnighters came out of Detroit, and so many others. I mean, and this is when Berry Gordy was in high school. Okay, so I mean, it's, you know, look, you can't analyze it. You can't look. You don't know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, you know who said it best? Rogers and Hammerstein. in one of their songs. Fools give you reasons, and wise men never try. It's from Some Enchanted Evening from South.
On that note,
Well, we have a few more minutes.
any fools out there?
A couple more people have a comment. Please, run ahead.
I want to go back to, the whole community idea, and what do you know, documentaries, especially documentaries about the people, and how people here got the music from the rock and roll records that came into the force. I know about, that's the geography angle that you were talking about as well, but there was also Bristol and Southampton, we just couldn't see it happening there. They've always got the same records.
Right.
But obviously the people here, certain catalysts here with Epstein and Bob Waller who were running the clubs and putting shows on. And then the community college was one where people got together and met each other. But I was just thinking that angle, that's basically how Liverpool set up, is the whole geography and the community, which I get the records from the port.
Can I ask a question? This is a real American question, so forgive me. But I know that the history of Liverpool, also in terms of an industrial place, was a lot of it was founded on slavery, and that was the history, and that's why the port got so big as part of the triangular trade. I'm often curious if anyone who's a Liverpoolian or can kind of school me. How much, if any, do you think that had to play a part in this dynamic with the acceptance of R&B and sort of black music in this particular city and the dynamic in the town? Is that a factor, that legacy in some form or another, or that was just too far disconnected? Anybody from town want to take a guess, take a swing? All right, here we go.
There are a couple of books about this, speculating. We can't really, there isn't enough hard evidence about it. But what there is more recently is, in the time of the Second World War, there was an American army base. I've suddenly forgotten the name of it, near Warrington. Burton Wood. And there's a lot of evidence there that a lot of black soldiers would spend their weekends in Liverpool and in Manchester, and they'd come and sing in the basement clubs and so on, and help generate a whole load of doo-wop singers, from which we get two rather famous all-black groups in Liverpool. The Burton Wood was closed down, I think, 1962, and then reopened again. When the French chucked out the Americans, they had to reopen it. So there's a new generation of blacks in Liverpool, influenced by their black cousins from North America, hanging around in between Manchester and Liverpool.
That's interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Black and